Welcome to our deep dive, everybody. Today we're taking a deep dive into Obergefell v. Hodges.
Obergefell v. Hodges. Oh yeah, this is the big one, right? This is the Supreme Court case that made same-sex marriage legal across the United States.
Yeah.
Back in 2015.
That's right, 2015. Feels like a lifetime ago now, doesn't it?
All right.
And, you might think at first that a case about marriage is just about couples,
Right.
But it actually gets a lot more interesting than that. We're talking about cases that involve children.
Oh, wow. Okay.
A widower, even a funeral director.
A funeral director? Wow.
Yeah, who's kind of caught in this weird, legal limbo.
Yeah, okay.
Even an adoption agency gets involved.
Wow, the ripple effects must have been huge.
Oh, massive. And here's the thing. Obergefell v. Hodges, it wasn't just one case. It was actually a combination of 6 lower court cases.
Okay.
From 4 different states.
Oh, wow.
Michigan, Ohio, Kentucky, and Tennessee.
So buckle up. This is going to be complicated.
Yeah, it's a story with a lot of twists and turns.
Yeah.
So to really understand Obergefell, I think we have to go back in time a bit, step back, look back.
All right, let's rewind.
So between January of 2012 and February of 2014, several same-sex couples filed lawsuits in those 4 states that we talked about.
Mm-hmm.
They were challenging their bans on same-sex marriage, so at the time, those 4 states all had laws that said, nope, same-sex couples, you can't get married here.
Right. So what happened? Did those lawsuits go anywhere?
They did. It's actually really interesting. All the district courts, like the initial courts that heard these cases, they ruled in favor of the couples.
Really? So they basically said these bans were unconstitutional?
Yeah, they saw those bans as just straight up unequal, and they sided with, the plaintiff's right to marry.
So it seemed like at that point, it was a clear victory for marriage equality. Right?
You would think. But you know what they say?
What's that?
It ain't over till it's over.
Oh boy, here we go.
Exactly, because the Sixth Circuit Court of Appeals, they had other plans. They overturned all those district court decisions.
Oh wow, really? On what grounds?
Well, they cited a 1972 Supreme Court case called Baker v. Nelson, which had basically dismissed a similar claim back then.
So they were saying, look, the Supreme Court already dealt with this, and they said no.
Yeah, essentially. But here's where it gets even more interesting.
Okay, I'm all ears.
This Sixth Circuit decision, it created what's called a circuit split.
A circuit split?
Yeah, it's basically when different federal courts are interpreting the law in totally opposite ways.
Oh, I see. So you had some courts saying same-sex marriage bans are unconstitutional, and others saying they're perfectly fine.
Exactly. And this kind of split often forces the Supreme Court to step in and give everyone a clear answer. They're like the referees of the legal system,
That makes sense. So basically, Obergefell landed in the Supreme Court's lap because the lower courts couldn't agree.
Right. It went from a state-level issue to a national showdown.
Wow, high stakes.
Huge. But before we get to all that Supreme Court drama, I think it's important to meet some of the people behind these 6 cases.
Yeah, put some faces to the legal arguments.
Exactly, because their personal stories really highlight how much this legal battle impacted real lives.
I bet. I mean, we're talking about people's right to marry the person they love. That's deeply personal.
Absolutely. For example, there was James Obergefell and John Arthur from Ohio.
Obergefell, as in the name of the case.
That's him. They got married in Maryland where it was legal, but when they went back home to Ohio, their marriage wasn't recognized.
Oh, wow, that's awful. Talk about a legal nightmare.
And to make things even worse, John was terminally ill.
So this wasn't just a legal battle, it was a race against time.
Absolutely. James was fighting for the right to be listed as John's surviving spouse on his death certificate. It was incredibly high stakes, incredibly emotional.
You can really see why this case resonated with so many people. It was about love, commitment, and basic human dignity.
Totally. And then there was another case, April DeBoer and Jane Rouse from Michigan.
What was their story?
They were raising 3 adopted children together, and they were challenging Michigan's adoption laws.
Ah, so this shows how the fight for marriage equality affected more than just couples, right? It impacted families too.
Absolutely. At the time, Michigan law only allowed single people or married couples to adopt.
So because April and Jane couldn't legally marry, their family was in a precarious legal situation.
Right. It was a huge legal gray area that put their family at risk. And then there's Henry v. Wymislow, also from Ohio. That one involved 4 couples, their child, and an adoption agency.
Wow, so the legal web gets even more tangled. What was at stake in that case?
It really highlighted how this debate about same-sex marriage affected so many different parts of family life. Marriage, adoption, parental rights, everything was up in the air.
It sounds like each case brought a new layer of complexity to this fight for marriage equality.
Absolutely. And ultimately, all these individual stories, they culminated in this massive Supreme Court showdown.
Okay, so we have the backdrop, the personal stories,
Yeah.
the legal wrangling. What were the big questions the Supreme Court was grappling with in Obergefell? What do they have to decide?
Well, at the heart of it all, there were two fundamental questions they were trying to answer. First, does the 14th Amendment require a state to license a marriage between two people of the same sex?
So basically, can states legally ban same-sex marriage, or does that violate the Constitution?
Exactly. And the second question was, does the 14th Amendment require a state to recognize a same-sex marriage that was legally performed in a different state?
So let's say you got married in a state where it was legal, but then moved to a state where it wasn't. Would that marriage still be valid?
That's the question. Those were the two big issues at stake in Obergefell.
Got it. Now, I've heard of the 14th Amendment, but how did it become so central to the debate over same-sex marriage?
That's a great question. It's all about the 14th Amendment's due process and equal protection clauses. They basically became like the stars of the show in Obergefell.
Okay, refresh my memory. What do those clauses actually say?
So the due process clause basically says the government can't take away your life, liberty, or property without following a fair legal process. It's all about protecting individual liberties from government overreach.
Right. And what about the Equal Protection Clause?
That one makes sure that laws apply equally to everyone. No special treatment or discrimination allowed.
So if I'm understanding correctly, the plaintiffs in Obergefell were arguing that these bans on same-sex marriage violated their fundamental right to marry, which is protected by the Due Process Clause, and that those bans treated them unequally compared to opposite-sex couples, violating the Equal Protection Clause.
Exactly, you got it. And get this, Obergefell v. Hodges attracted a record-breaking 148 amicus curiae briefs.
Wait, 148? What, were they running out of paper at the courthouse?
Apparently not. And for those of us who aren't lawyers, what exactly is an amicus curiae brief?
It's basically a document filed by someone who isn't directly involved in the case, but they have an interest in the outcome. Like, they might be experts in a certain field, or they might represent a group that would be affected by the decision. They basically give the court extra information to consider.
Okay, so it's like outside voices chiming in with their perspectives?
Yeah, exactly. And in Obergefell, you had everyone from legal scholars to religious groups to major businesses weighing in. Even 379 major businesses signed on to one brief in support of marriage equality.
Wow, 379. That's a lot of corporate clout behind this issue.
It shows you how much attention this case was getting across society. This wasn't just a legal debate, it was a national conversation.
It sounds like the entire country was holding its breath, waiting to see what the Supreme Court would decide.
Absolutely. The tension was palpable. Oral arguments were heard on April 28, 2015, and all eyes were on Justice Anthony Kennedy.
Why was he so important?
He was considered the potential swing vote. The other justices were pretty much divided along ideological lines, so everyone knew Kennedy's vote would likely determine the outcome of the entire case.
It must felt like the fate of marriage equality rested on his shoulders.
No pressure, right?
So then what happened? What was the final verdict?
Well, on June 26, 2015, the Supreme Court delivered its decision, a 5-4 ruling in favor of marriage equality.
5-4, so it was close. What a moment in history.
Absolutely. A landmark victory for the LGBTQ plus community and a major turning point in American history.
All right, so last time we talked about how Obergefell v. Hodges made its way to the Supreme Court. It was quite the journey.
Yeah, a lot of twists and turns. Legal battles, personal stories, the whole 9 yards.
Absolutely. But in the end, the Supreme Court ruled in favor of marriage equality. And a big part of that ruling, I mean, the heart of it really, was Justice Anthony Kennedy's majority opinion.
Yeah, that opinion was pretty pivotal, I'd say. It wasn't just a legal document. It was like a statement, you know, a statement about love, about equality, about the very meaning of marriage.
So more than just, it's legal now, he was explaining why it should be legal.
Exactly. And he did it so eloquently. He really connected the dots between individual liberty and equality. You know?
Oh, yeah.
He framed the issue not as like some special right to same-sex marriage,
Right.
but as part of this fundamental right to marry that already existed.
So he was saying, hey, this isn't something new. This is just applying existing rights to everyone.
Yeah, precisely. And denying that right to same-sex couples, he argued, that was just pure discrimination. no legitimate purpose.
And I remember reading about how Justice Kennedy talked about the profound nature of marriage. He wasn't just talking about legal stuff. He was talking about love and commitment and all that.
Oh, absolutely. He didn't shy away from the emotion of it all. He talked about how marriage embodies, like, love, fidelity, devotion, sacrifice, family, all the big stuff.
The good stuff.
Yeah. And his point was that there's no difference between same-sex couples and opposite-sex couples in their capacity for those things.
I mean, why should there be?
Exactly. Love is love, right?
And I remember there was this argument floating around. I think it was from some of the groups that were opposed to same-sex marriage, that it would somehow harm the institution of marriage.
Oh, yeah, that argument.
Like, it would discourage opposite-sex couples from getting married or something?
Yeah, that argument never made much sense to me.
Yeah, I don't really see the connection there.
Justice Kennedy called that notion counterintuitive and unrealistic.
Which it is. I mean, people get married for all sorts of reasons, right? It's about love, companionship, building a life together.
Exactly. And he pointed out that the right to marry in the U.S., it's never been contingent on procreation, Plenty of opposite-sex couples choose not to have children, or they can't have children,
Yeah.
and that doesn't affect their right to marry.
So why should it be any different for same-sex couples? If they want to make that commitment, build a life together, why should they be excluded?
Exactly. And Kennedy argued that excluding same-sex couples from marriage actually caused harm. Like, it denied them legal and social benefits that come with marriage. It undermined their equality under the law. He really flipped the script on that argument,
So it sounds like he was really using, like, legal principles and just a sense of basic fairness to make his case.
Yeah, and it's so interesting how he linked the Due Process Clause, which is all about individual liberty, with the Equal Protection Clause, which is about equality.
Two sides of the same coin. It's like he was saying you can't have true liberty without equality, and vice versa.
Exactly. And another thing that stood out to me was how Justice Kennedy addressed the concerns of people who oppose same-sex marriage.
Okay, so how did he handle that?
He acknowledged the role of the democratic process, voting and all that, but he also made it clear that fundamental rights can't be left up to a vote.
So even if the majority of people in a state voted against same-sex marriage, the Constitution still protects the rights of the minority. Makes sense, right?
Precisely. It's a really powerful statement about the role of the courts in protecting individual rights, even when those rights are unpopular.
And he wasn't diminishing the importance of democracy or anything like that. He was just highlighting how sometimes majority rule isn't enough when it comes to protecting fundamental rights.
Yeah, the Constitution is there to make sure everyone is treated fairly, regardless of what the majority might think.
And he also emphasized that, the First Amendment still protects people who hold different views on same-sex marriage.
Right, so he was advocating for respect on both sides of the issue, while also upholding the principle of equality under the law.
What a balancing act. He had to acknowledge opposing viewpoints without compromising the core message of the ruling.
And I think one of the most memorable parts of his opinion is that closing statement.
Oh, yeah, that's the one that gets quoted all the time.
Yeah, it's pretty powerful stuff.
What was it again? Do you remember the exact quote?
Yeah, I think I do. He said, "No union is more profound than marriage, for it embodies the highest ideals of love, fidelity, devotion, sacrifice, and family. In forming a marital union, two people become something greater than once they were." As some of the petitioners in these cases demonstrate, marriage embodies a love that may endure even past death. It would misunderstand these men and women to say they disrespect the idea of marriage. Their plea is that they do respect it so deeply that they seek to find its fulfillment for themselves. Their hope is not to be condemned to live in loneliness, excluded from one of civilization's oldest institutions. They ask for equal dignity in the eyes of the law. The Constitution grants them that right.
Wow. That's just beautiful. He really captured the essence of it all, the legal reasoning, the human rights aspect, and the deeply personal stories of the couples involved.
It's hard to overstate the impact of that closing statement. It really humanized the whole issue and made it clear that this wasn't just about abstract legal concepts. It was about real people's lives and their right to love and be loved.
And on the other side of the coin, we had the dissenting opinions. Justice Kennedy's was like a symphony, but what about the justices who disagreed with the ruling? What did their opinions sound like?
Well, it's important to remember that each of the dissenting justices, that's Chief Justice Roberts and Justices Scalia, Thomas, and Alito, they each wrote their own opinion. So you had a whole range of concerns and criticisms being voiced. 4
different perspectives, all disagreeing with the majority opinion in their own way.
Exactly. So it's not like there was one unified dissenting voice. It was more like 4 different threads of disagreement, which just adds to the complexity of this whole issue,
It's like a legal tapestry woven from different viewpoints.
Exactly. And even though they were on the losing side, those dissenting opinions still offer valuable insights into the debate surrounding same-sex marriage. They remind us that even on something as fundamental as love and marriage, there are different perspectives, different interpretations of the law, and different ideas about how society should function.
So were there any common themes running through these different dissents?
Definitely. A big one was this idea that the court had overstepped its bounds. That this was an issue for the states to decide, not the judiciary.
Right, so they were saying the court shouldn't be making sweeping social policy decisions. That's the job of the legislature.
Exactly. They felt like the court was wading into territory that rightfully belonged to elected officials, that it was a violation of the separation of powers.
It's a classic debate about the role of the judiciary in a democracy, right? How much power should the courts have? Where do we draw the line between judicial review and legislative authority?
Big questions. And these questions go way beyond the issue of same-sex marriage. They touch upon the very foundation of our government and how power is balanced between different branches.
Exactly. It's not just about who gets to marry who, it's about the fundamental principles of our democracy. And did those dissenting justices, did they address those arguments about equal protection and due process? Or were they just focused on this separation of powers issue?
Oh, they definitely had their own interpretations of those concepts. For example, Chief Justice Roberts, he actually agreed with the idea of substantive due process.
Substantive due process. Okay, for those of us who don't spend all day reading legal textbooks, what does that even mean?
Well, it's this idea that the Constitution protects certain fundamental rights, even if they aren't explicitly spelled out in the text.
Okay, so they're like implied rights.
Yeah, exactly. They're considered essential to liberty and justice.
Right.
But even though Roberts accepted this idea of substantive due process, he argued that the right to same-sex marriage didn't fit the criteria to be considered a fundamental right.
So he was saying, okay, some rights are implied by the Constitution, but same-sex marriage isn't one of them.
Yeah, essentially. He pointed to the historical definition of marriage as between a man and a woman to support his position. It was like he was saying, look, this is how it's always been, so why change it now?
Tradition as justification for maintaining the status quo.
Yeah, that was definitely a recurring theme in the dissents. And remember how Justice Kennedy was arguing that the Constitution is a living document, that it needs to be interpreted in light of evolving social norms.
Right, like it's not set in stone.
Exactly. And that's where you see a fundamental clash between the majority opinion and the dissenting opinions. It's this debate about tradition versus contemporary understandings of rights and equality. And Justice Alito also emphasized tradition and historical precedent in his dissent.
Did he have any specific concerns about the impact of the Obergefell decision?
He was worried that it might be used to undermine the beliefs of those who opposed same-sex marriage, potentially leading to social conflict and restrictions on free speech. He felt that the majority opinion had sort of dismissed the legitimate concerns of a significant portion of the population.
That's a valid point. Change can be unsettling, and it's important to acknowledge the anxieties that some people might feel when long-held beliefs and traditions are challenged.
Absolutely. And, several of the dissenting justices, especially Chief Justice Roberts and Justice Alito, they brought up religious liberty as a major concern.
Yeah, that was a big part of the debate around Obergefell. What were their specific concerns?
Well, they were worried that religious institutions and individuals who oppose same-sex marriage might be forced to participate in or endorse same-sex marriages.
Like being forced to perform a same-sex marriage ceremony or something.
Exactly. They argue that this would violate their sincerely held religious beliefs.
It raises this whole complex question of how to balance LGBTQ+ rights with religious freedom.
Yeah, it's a tough one. And the Obergefell decision didn't really offer any clear-cut answers on that front. Justice Kennedy acknowledged the importance of protecting religious freedom, but he didn't go into detail about how that would work in practice.
So it's like they left that door open for further debate and legal wrangling.
Exactly. And we've seen those debates continue to play out in the years since Obergefell, We've seen cases involving businesses refusing to serve same-sex couples based on religious objections, and those cases raise all sorts of thorny legal and ethical questions about where to draw the line between religious freedom and discrimination.
So while Obergefell was a landmark victory for marriage equality, it also kind of opened a new chapter in the fight for LGBTQ plus rights.
I think that's a great way to put it. And in recent years, as we mentioned earlier, the Dobbs decision and Justice Thomas's concurring opinion, they've really raised concerns about the potential vulnerability of Obergefell and other precedents based on the right to privacy.
Right, like that whole what's next kind of anxiety.
Exactly. If one right can be overturned, then what's to stop other rights from being rolled back?
It's definitely a time of uncertainty, and that uncertainty can be pretty unsettling.
For sure. But amidst all that, it's also important to remember the resilience of the LGBTQ plus rights movement and the power of collective action. We saw that power in action with the passage of the Respect for Marriage Act, which aims to solidify same-sex marriage rights into federal law. It was a proactive move to protect marriage equality in the face of these new challenges.
So it's like a preemptive strike, trying to head off potential threats to same-sex marriage before they even arise.
Exactly, and it shows that lawmakers are paying attention to these shifting legal landscapes and trying to stay ahead of the curve. It's like a constant push and pull between progress and resistance.
It's like a never-ending tug of war, but hopefully, with each push and pull, we inch closer and closer to a more just and equitable society. Okay, so we've talked about the legal arguments, we've talked about the dissenting opinions, but now I kind of want to talk about what happened after the decision, you know?
Right, like what was the actual impact of Obergefell on like everyday life for LGBTQ plus people?
Yeah, exactly. Like, did things really change? And if so, how?
Well, the most immediate and obvious impact was that millions of same-sex couples across the country could finally get married, like legally married.
Yeah, I bet there were a lot of happy couples out there. It must have been such a huge relief, you know? To finally have their relationships recognized and celebrated in the same way as opposite-sex couples.
Absolutely. It was a moment of joy, of validation, of just pure happiness for so many people. And it wasn't just about those individual celebrations, you know? Obergefell had ripple effects across so many areas of life.
Like what?
Well, think about family law, adoption policies, inheritance rights. All of a sudden, same-sex couples were on equal footing with opposite-sex couples, you know? They had access to the same legal protections, the same benefits, and that brought a lot of stability and security to their families.
Yeah, I mean, it makes sense, right? If you're legally married, you get all these rights and benefits that you wouldn't have otherwise. So Obergefell really opened up those doors for same-sex couples.
Exactly. And it wasn't just about the legal stuff either, you know? Obergefell also had a huge impact on social attitudes and perceptions of LGBTQ plus people and their relationships.
Yeah, I remember after the decision, there were all these images of same-sex couples getting married, celebrating, just like beaming with joy.
Yeah, it was all over the media, social media, everywhere.
It felt like a real shift in how LGBTQ plus people were being portrayed, you know? More visibility, more acceptance.
Totally. I think Obergefell really helped to normalize same-sex relationships and chip away at those old prejudices and stereotypes that have been around for so long.
So it wasn't just a legal victory, it was a cultural victory too.
Exactly. And that's really important because laws can change, but changing hearts and minds, that's a much bigger, deeper kind of change.
Absolutely. But, you know, like with any big societal shift, there was also some pushback, right? Some people weren't happy about the decision.
Oh yeah, definitely. We saw a lot of resistance from conservative groups, politicians, you know, the usual suspects.
Like what kind of resistance?
Well, there were attempts to pass laws that would allow businesses to refuse service to same-sex couples based on religious grounds.
Those religious freedom laws that we hear so much about.
Yeah, exactly those. And they became a really contentious issue because it's like, where do you draw the line between religious freedom and discrimination?
It's a tough question, and it's one that we're still grappling with today.
Absolutely. And then in recent years, you know, the Dobbs decision and Justice Thomas's opinion, they've kind of cast a shadow over Obergefell.
Right, like, is it safe? Is it going to be overturned?
Exactly. People are worried that if the court can overturn Roe v. Wade, then maybe Obergefell is next on the chopping block.
That's scary. I mean, Obergefell felt like such a huge step forward, and now it feels like maybe we're taking a step back.
It's definitely a time of uncertainty, and that uncertainty can be really unsettling for a lot of people. But, you know, in the midst of all that uncertainty, there's also hope.
Oh, yeah. Like what?
Well, remember the Respect for Marriage Act that we talked about earlier? That was a huge victory for LGBTQ plus rights.
Yeah, that was the one that codified same-sex marriage rights into federal law, right?
Exactly. And that was a direct response to the concerns raised by the Dobbs decision.
So it's like, okay, if the Supreme Court isn't going to protect our rights, then Congress will step up and do it.
Right. It was a way of saying, we're not going back, we're moving forward. And that's really powerful.
And I think it also shows that progress isn't always linear, you know? Sometimes you take 2 steps forward and then 1 step back, but as long as we keep pushing, keep fighting, we'll eventually get there.
I totally agree. And even though there are still challenges ahead, I'm optimistic about the future.
Me too. And I think Obergefell will always be a symbol of that hope, you know? A reminder that change is possible, that love wins, and that even in the face of opposition, we can create a more just and equitable world.
It's been amazing talking about this with you.
Yeah, absolutely. It's been a wild ride revisiting Obergefell, all the legal drama, the personal stories, and the lasting impact.
A lot to unpack.
It really is. And you know, it just goes to show you that the law isn't just some abstract thing. It affects real people's lives in profound ways.
It's the foundation of our society, really.
Exactly. Well, that's it for our deep dive into Obergefell v. Hodges. We hope you learned something new and that you're feeling inspired to keep fighting for equality, for justice, for love.
Cheers to that.
And if you want to learn more, you know, dig deeper into this landmark case and its legacy, you know, there are tons of resources out there.
Yeah, get out there, read up, and stay informed.
We'll catch you next time on The Deep Dive.